Hello watch lovers, welcome back to the channel. Today we have José's watch on the bench, and this one has some very fundamental issues. We're going to see that as soon as we take the watch out of this plastic bag it came in. And there's a reason it came in the plastic bag. And that is that there is no bezel. Someone just put an oversized crystal over the watch, and that was then supposed to serve as a bezel and crystal. We can also see that the Chronograph second hand, the red one, is a bit broken. There should be a counterweight on the opposite side of the tip, which is no longer there, and I suppose it's reasonable to assume that that might have happened at the same time that the bezel came off, together with the crystal, most likely. But we see that the watch does run, although not entirely great, but we'll see what we can do about that. And the chronograph also works. And it's got a very nice dial, I think. So the main challenge for this watch is then to make a bezel. Yeah, that's what we're gonna do. We're gonna make a bezel for this watch. This is a Chronograph Swiss watch, as we can see by the back coming off that easily, and by there being a second case back inside it, which is actually what gives the watch some sort of integrity. So even if it says Exim on the dial, it is a Chronograph Swiss watch. And that means that the case is horrendously flimsy. Hollow lugs and very little metal to go around. We're going to see exactly how little a little bit later on, but it's always a challenge trying to case these watches, because it's just so little metal and it's so thin and flimsy. And yes, it is 18 karat gold, but there's so little of it. Anyway, we did take the movement out of the case, put the crown back on, and then we can take off the hands. You can see that underneath the dial there is some sort of ring, and that is also to help create a little bit more case integrity. Well, let's get the hands off. So the dial of these old watches are typically secured from the underside. There are a couple of dog screws with a sharp edge that then cuts into the dial feet and thus holds the dial in place. So I mentioned that this is a Chronograph Swiss watch. These watches were typically 18 karat gold, but then with very thin cases and the hollow lugs and the whole shebang. They were sold more or less as souvenirs. So affordable watches, sometimes really good looking, like this one. Most of them had land-run movements, which were cheaper. This one is a Venus 170 movement. And typically when you have a chronograph from this era with an up and down register, so 12 and 6 o'clock, then it's a very good chance that it is this movement. It's also not a very expensive movement, or wasn't a very expensive movement. It was priced quite similarly to the Landron 47, 48s and so forth. Not produced in massive numbers, but it does have a few interesting design choices and some less ideal. What the chronograph buffs among you have probably already noticed is that there is no horizontal clutch in this chronograph. There is a vertical oscillating pinion, actually invented in the late 1800s, but of course popularized especially in the 7750. And here we see it. Quite similar to in the modern chronograph 7750 family. But apart from that, the design doesn't have a lot of similarities with a lot of other chronographs. We'll also see that the click is actually on the dial side. And there's also a rocker. So all in all, a pretty unconventional design. That is, of course, one of the beauties of working on old watches, that you do get to see a lot of different movement designs. So yeah, that is part of what makes it so much fun to work on vintage watches. You might have seen that the balance wobbled a little bit, or the hairspring to be precise. So we're going to have a closer look at that later. We just see first that the pivots look all right. Another interesting part of this design is this double pallet bridge, which covers both the pallet cock and the escape wheel. As you might also have noticed, I do put pretty much all the screws for the chronograph back into the screw hole after taking the part out. That helps making sure that you have the right screw for the right hole later. A little bit old oil makes some parts stick, and that's perfectly fine. That will come off in the cleaning machine. What we don't want to find are broken jewels, bent pivots, that kind of thing. Now that we've taken all the parts off on the train side, we can then turn the movement over and start disassembling the keyless works. We see that the movement has a rocker, this part here. So one end engages the time setting train, and the other end engages the winding system. So that's also quite different from the typical sliding and winding pinion setup. I actually think rockers are very cool, and they do make the movement a little bit thinner. So yeah, all this variety does make it fun to work on old watches. On the other hand, it's of course frustrating sometimes working on old watches, because parts are not readily available. Of course, had this been a modern watch, you would probably have been able to find the bezel for this watch instead of having to make one. But again, the flimsy nature of the cases of these watches made that both the case back and the bezel would come off very easily. So it's quite common to find that those have both been glued in place. Anyway, we're getting close to finishing the disassembly. Just going to take the mainspring out. Let's see what type of mainspring this is. Oh, this is an oldie and not goldie. Well, it's sort of gold colored, which does mean it is an old mainspring. So these old spiral types, the main problem with them is that the power varies quite a lot. So between a fully coiled spring and a nearly uncoiled one is a big difference in the power supply. So some sort of green blob in the barrel there. I'm not sure what that's about, but we are going to clean it anyway. With all the parts laid out, we're ready to put them into the basket and into the cleaning machine. I don't put everything into the cleaning machine. The most fragile parts, like typically the minute jumper spring on chronographs, plastic parts, very delicate parts, I do not put in the cleaning machine. Those I clean separately. Let me also take this opportunity to thank my members, both on YouTube and on Patreon. You guys make a big difference, so thanks so much. The latest members-only project we're working on is called the Chronometer Project, where we're trying to take a standard 6497 or 98 and turn it into a chronometer performing movement. If you're curious about what a membership would give you, then you can check it out by clicking the join button below. Don't worry, you're not joining automatically. but you will see the options, or you can go to this URL on patreon.com. And no, I have no clue what the other 88 vintage watch services on Patreon do. Let's start reassembling the watch. We're gonna do the barrel first. We've gotten a new mainspring for the movement. So for those thinking, you're right, I didn't have to put grease into the barrel drum. But it turns out that the mainspring is a little bit too big for the barrel, so I cannot simply press it in. So I'm going to just put it into my mainspring winder and then put it into the barrel that way. I'm not showing putting the mainspring onto or into the mainspring winder, but I have plenty of videos you can check out for that. Then putting the barrel arbor in. The best way is to make sure that the little hook on the arbor goes into the little eye at the end of the mainspring. You might have seen that this one was a little bit tight, so I used an old broken oiler to help the barrel arbor in. And then we can press on the lid again. We also need to lubricate with the other end of the barrel arbor, rotates inside the drum. And then we can turn our attention to the balance. So this balance does not have a shock setting, so we need to actually take the balance complete off the cock and then disassemble the balance before we can... didn't even notice that before. So the hairspring is bent at the stud, so we're gonna have to do something about that. And looking at this up close, it's pretty impressive this watch was even running, to be honest. I did see the hairspring wobble, but this looks much worse than I would expect. So working on the hairsprings is always a little nerve-wracking, even when you've done it a few times. The key, I think, is to not want to do too much with any one action. Much better to do 10 small actions than one big one. Because you cannot unbend metal. You can only sort of try to bend the rest of it back to a more or less normal shape. But the bend that was originally there will always be there. So the metal will always be a bit damaged there. But that should suffice for now, so we can continue on. Might have to do some more adjustments to the hairspring later. So taking off the regulator, we then access the capstone. And then we're going to immerse these parts, which form the escapement of the watch, in epilam. The epilam will leave a very thin film on the surface of these parts, and that film will help the lubrication stay in place a bit better. And yes, this hourglass-shaped bottle is the most expensive piece of glass in the world, I think. Sells for some 150 euros, dollars, pounds, whatever you want. Not sure if the Chinese has yet come up with a competitor. Because honestly, I have started seeing quite some good quality tools from China. So yeah, I think the Swiss manufacturers have to start looking out for that. With the parts clean and with the epilam on it, we can then oil the capstones. Put a little tiny drop of thin oil at the center. And then we put the cock back on top. So the balance is, let's say, the beating heart of the watch. It oscillates rapidly back and forth. And every time it goes past the middle again, and past the center, if you will, it lets the whole train down a little bit, so that the train escapes a little bit. That's why this mechanism is called the escapement. The balance assembly together with the pallet fork and the escape wheel. And in this type of movement, commonly called the Swiss lever movement, The escapement actually steals most of the power from the mainspring. And that's why we try to reduce the friction as much as possible on the balance. So that the balance has pivots of hardened and burnished steel. And when they rotate on the jewels with a little bit of lubrication, the friction is minimal. So let's see if that friction is really low. Yeah, that looks pretty frictionless. So with that, let's get on with the train. So again, it's a bit unconventional, but this movement has the ratchet wheel on the underside of the barrel. And that is then also where the click is. The rest of the train is quite conventional. Apart from that, in most chronographs from this era, we would have an extended pivot on the fourth wheel. And on top of that pivot, at top of the bridge, you would have the chronograph driving wheel. But as we already know, this movement has an oscillating pinion instead. So we can then already put the bridge on. So let me, by the way, know in the comments if you guys have worked on this type of movement, the Venus 170. It was produced, I think, 15 years or so. It was initially quite popular because of the up and down registers. But then, yeah, the interest faded, I think. But it did form the basis for some other interesting movements from Venus, so yeah. With the train side ready, we can then assemble the keyless works. So I've been working on watches for some 20 years, give or take. The first few years more as a hobby, and then the last 6-7 years completely full-time, with a sort of ramp up in between. But I still to this day get movements on my bench that I haven't worked on before, which I think is really cool. I have worked on this one before, but only 2 times before this one. One great benefit of working on these old watches is that you get a really broad overview of all kinds of different ways to solve things. So I recently went to the UK for what is hopefully my last exam at the British Horological Institute. And one thing that was interesting, I must say, I flew like a king from Switzerland, Geneva, to Manchester. I flew like a king that's been overthrown by a popular coup d'etat and just has to get the hell out of Dodge. So as you can probably tell, I flew with EasyJet. I consider myself a pretty well-rounded person, quite in peace with the world and everyone in it. Except bloody EasyJet, man. I goddamn hate that airline. Pardon my français. So it's a so-called no-frills airline. So it's cheap. That is, the fare itself is cheap. But then you pay for absolutely everything else. So if you want a cup of tea, yes sir, that's like £3. I'm surprised they don't charge you for going to a toilet. And I hope I'm not giving them any ideas by saying that. Now, one of the most annoying things with EasyJet is that they always exaggerate these warnings. So if it says go to gate or boarding, and you then go to the gate, you find out it's like half an hour until they actually start boarding. Very annoying. Now, I am going to continue my rant about bloody EasyJet, but let's just first see if the keyless works. So we see there is a little bit of an issue here with the time setting. Now, one of the weak points with this movement is the cannon pinion here. It does have a tendency to come loose, but also the minute wheel that it's engaging with is held in place by a spring. And if this cock is not holding the wheel down, it can bind quite easily. So with that cock in place, it works much better. So then we can put the movement back over on the train side and lubricate the pallets. Now this is another major source of friction in Swiss lever movements. You have this locking and then a sliding action over the pallet stones. So to reduce that, we lubricate the pallet stones. You might remember that there was epilam on all of these parts, and I did let the movement run for a couple of minutes before lubricating this, and that makes a little groove in the epilam film, which makes the oil stay better in place in the middle of the pallet stones. So with that, we can then put the balance back in. We want to make very sure we locate the bottom pivot into the jewel hole there. And then we rotate the balance so that the impulse jewel goes into the notch in the fork. Always nice to see that balance fire up. So with the watch running, we're going to lubricate the pivots, the jewel holes, also called oil sinks. They should not be filled with oil, that would be way too much. But we do need to lubricate them. So we're doing that here. And then we can put the watch on the needle magnetizer and then on the Timegrapher. And I'm really not sure what this is going to look like. Oh, looks like Christmas came early this year. I don't mean the presents, I mean the snow. That's not necessarily such a bad thing. We just need to adjust the regulator a little bit and see if we can get the time a little bit closer to 0 seconds a day. And as we do that, we are starting to see about the same beat error we had before servicing the movement. Now we should keep our expectations in check here. We are going to be happy with this type of level of accuracy. The beat error is a little bit too high, so we will have to do something about that. But let's first have a look at the hairspring. Remember, we had to fix it, so we see it's not really developing very nicely. Now we could take the hairspring off and adjust it separately, but we can also try to adjust it in situ, simply by trying to manipulate the end curve. Basically just pressing a little bit on the hairspring where it comes out from the stud to create a little bit more breathing space on the opposite side. And that works pretty okay, I think. And miracle of miracles, it also helped on the beat error. So yeah, we're going to be happy with that. Watch does not keep that rate in all positions, but it's not a chronometer and it is an old worn watch, so we're quite happy as we go along with this. So that means we can start assembling the chronograph. I am, however, not done with EasyJet. Oh, by far not. So going there, obviously, the plane was 2 hours delayed, more or less. It was supposed to leave around 11, and then all of a sudden it said, no, it's going to be 1:45. So I was sitting there, minding my own business, your typical innocent bystander, reading a book on marine chronometers, and then occasionally checking the flight monitors to see what was happening. And it kept saying relax, so basically just stay put. And then around 10 minutes before 12, all of a sudden the screen said the final call. And I was sitting there enjoying a coffee in a cafe there, and then of course I had to rally my stuff and hurry over to the gate. And then when I arrived at the gate, half running, obviously nothing. Not boarding, no nothing. There was a sign saying that the boarding will start in 40 minutes. My God, man. And I was not the only one annoyed with that, obviously. There were quite a few people talking to the poor EasyJet clerk right there. Anyway, we started assembling the chronograph parts. Now, the chronograph is somewhat confusing on this movement, I have to say. There are quite a few parts, more than you would typically have. A chronograph, first of all, has to have some sort of controlling mechanism, and that's either a cam or a column wheel. This one has a column wheel. Then you have your counting wheels. You have some sort of connection between the drivetrain and the chronograph parts. The oscillating pinion, which we just put in here. And then you have some decoupling mechanisms or a clutch. And then you also have a brake mechanism. So that when you pause your chronograph, the seconds hand pauses immediately. Now this one, of course, has all of those things. It's just a few extra parts in between, which can be a bit confusing. Also, the operating lever on this movement is very short, working directly on the column wheel, which is also quite unconventional. So when working on this kind of watch, it's always good to try to find the technical communication, of course, or at least the part description, so that you know what the different parts do. And of course, if the watch works before you start working on it, then it's a good idea to take a lot of photos or even videos as you disassemble things. So here I'm putting on the operating lever, which is not much of a lever, it's pretty much just a pusher, this one. Pushes directly on the column wheel. And as is quite common, we have this double spring on both the operating lever and the reset lever, to make sure they spring back out after being depressed. And then there's a couple of screws holding that spring in place. So you might have also noticed there are a lot of screws in this movement. So that's one of the thing as well. Few posts, a lot of shoulder screws for wheels and different parts to rotate on. Also, the chronograph wheel is more or less resting on this friction spring here. We're going to see later that this spring was not tight enough. But for now, we're going to put the chronograph wheel in. And then we can put in the chronograph bridge. Now, before screwing down the bridge and basically any bridge, we want to make very sure that the pivots are in the jewel holes. Otherwise, they're going to snap right off. Just a few more parts then. We have the hammer, which resets the chronograph counting wheels. And then we have the hammer spring that makes sure that the hammer hits the chronograph wheels with some force. All right, let's try the chronograph. And we see that the hammer goes much too deep by using the operating lever here. So there's not much space left for the hammer to hit the heart-shaped cams on the top of the chronograph wheels. So that's something we want to change, and we do that by manipulating this eccentric here. And then we can try again. And then we'll see we have a much better action. All right. So then we're going to lubricate the last few friction points. On the column wheel, we need to make sure that the ratchet on the underside is lubricated, as well as the columns themselves. Don't have to lubricate all the wheels or the columns, every third or so should be good. And then we also lubricate the chronograph wheel, but not the minute counting wheel. We also need to lubricate the hammer, both of them. We could lubricate the hardship cam as well, but it's probably easier to lubricate the hammer. And there we have a nice action with the reset. We still haven't put on the minute counter jumper, so let's do that. This is a very, very thin spring, and it's easily the most fragile part of the chronograph movement. So we're going to be very careful with it. But with it in place, we can then have a closer look at how the chronograph counting mechanism works. So on the right side, we have the oscillating pinion, which then drives the chronograph wheel at the center. On the underside of the chronograph wheel, actually hidden here, is a little finger that flicks over the intermediate counting wheel, which then flicks over the minute counting wheel. Now tell me in the comments below, why is there an intermediate wheel there? Why couldn't that finger on the chronograph wheel just flick the minute counting wheel directly over? Let me know. But with all the parts in place, we can then put on the hour wheel, that plate underneath the dial, and then the dial itself. And then we secure it with those dog screws. And so, the case. I told you that the case is flimsy, so let's see how much it weighs. So a solid gold case itself of this size would be around 10 grams, 8 to 10 grams perhaps. This one is less than 3, and even with the case back it's still less than 6. And then if we put on an actual solid gold case with the case back and the crystal, but the crystal is very light, which it's just less than 16 grams. So we want to make this bezel, we actually have to make it so that it supports the integrity of the case. So I measured the various components of the case, and this is what I came up with for the profile of the bezel. It's worth noting that the cutout for where the bezel snaps onto the case at the bottom here, and for where the crystal snaps in, are slightly undercut, around 5 degrees. The other measurements are basically to allow the space for the dial, and also for this metal ring under the dial. It's going to be difficult to make this fit perfectly, but hopefully good enough. So let's get over to the lathe. And no, I'm not going to cut this from gold. That would be much more gold than this watch was ever worth. I'm going to cut it from brass, and then gold plate the brass afterwards. So I'm going to start by facing off this 5 centimeter rod of brass. You might have seen from the drawing that the case outside the diameter is 38 millimeters. After facing one side, I cut off a disc, and then I can face the other side. So just so we're all on the same page, facing is basically just making the surface flat. As you can imagine, when you cut this by hand, it's not going to be perfectly flat, far from it. So then I need to cut off everything so it becomes nice and flat. And the result is basically a big giant brass coin. Then the outside diameter I cut separately off camera. But then we need to cut the lip where the bezel fits onto the case. And that should be 37 millimeters. So here we have that. This is a crucial point. I had to do this a few times, because if you miss by 0.1 millimeter, you're gone. But this seems to work. And that means we can cut out the rest of the profile on the underside of the bezel. Here we see the lip. So back to the lathe and cutting away the rest of the underside of the bezel before we're then going to turn this bezel and cut the top side. So those first operations were all to cut the underside of the bezel. Now to cut the top side, we need to maintain the profile that we already cut. So the way we're going to do that is to use a so-called slug, which is basically just another disc of brass. but it has the same diameter as a case, so that our profile will then fit snugly onto it, and then we're going to fix it in place with shellac. Now the pieces of shellac I put on were a little bit too big, even though they are actually pretty small, but a bit bigger than they should be. What I want to achieve is that the shellac melts, and then I'm going to put my bezel on, and then make the shellac melt a little bit more, so that there's a tight fit between the bezel and the slug. So I'm going to heat the shellac a little bit more, and then press down with a piece of brass on top of it. Not optimal, and I did learn from this, so I think I can do it better the next time. We don't want the shellac to really boil, but we do want it to be very liquid. That way there's as little gap as possible between the slug and the bezel. I'm going to press it down a little bit extra to try to minimize that gap. Then back to the lathe. Remember that we did cut the underside, now we're cutting the top side. First thing I'm doing here is to just face off the top as well. The most important diameter here is for the crystal. I did measure that so that I have a crystal that fits. I do need to make a small undercut here. So I've angled my cutter around 5 degrees. So here I'm getting in position to undercut for the crystal seating. So we can see that we're starting to get a diameter there. About 0.5 millimeter deep. That is sufficient for the crystal. One thing I didn't show is that I also cut a round profile on the outer side, so the top corner, if you will, or the top ring, so that it looks a bit more like the original case. So here we cut away the brass, so we're getting down to the shellac. So that means we're good. So I'm going to clean it up a little bit and then start the polishing. So you can see here I already cut the rounded profile. I just did that with a hand engraver. And then we're doing the polishing. And then afterwards I put the whole assembly into acetone, cleaned everything, and then gold plated the bezel. And one gold plated brass bezel. Not perfect, but good enough, I think. Here's a little gap for getting a tool in between the bezel and the case, so it's not completely snug. So with that, let's put the crystal in place. We do that with a crystal press. We put this little, let's call it an anvil perhaps, that will serve to bend the crystal down with the pressure from the press, and then we can fit the bezel onto the crystal. And then the crystal will expand into that undercut groove. So then time to case the movement. We're first going to put the pushers in. So the pushers are simply held in place in the case. There's no spring, no nothing like that, and absolutely zero water protection. I think this watch is about as waterproof as a natural sponge. Then we have the other metal ring that helps create some integrity for this case on the opposite side, so on the back of the case, held in place by 2 screws. Now, unscrewing this back plate together, I am doing it in a not optimal way. I'll get back to that later. Let's first just place the hands. There is no date on this watch, so we can put the hour hand wherever we want. Doesn't have to be a 12. Of course, when we put the minute hand on, we need to make sure that that one is aligned with the hour hand. Now, all the time while I'm doing this, this watch just wants to fall apart. The case is so thin, and it's gold, so it's very soft. So basically pressing a little bit too hard on something, it's going to bend the case or whichever part. And regular viewers might have noticed that I didn't clean the case in the ultrasonic. And the reason is because it is so thin. Normally that would be okay, but if you have paid very close attention, you might have seen that the case is actually broken a little bit. On one of the lugs there is a hole in the case, and running very thin metal like that with a hole in it through the ultrasonic is most likely gonna break it up. So that's why I didn't show any cleaning of the case in the ultrasonic slow motion as I normally do. So I had to tighten the second sand a little bit. There is a tool for that. Of course there is. And it's expensive. So the old school way of tightening a tube for a hand like that would be to put it in a collet in a watchmaker's lathe and then tighten the collet. Of course the tool is cheaper than the watchmaker's lathe, but not that much. So yeah. Here we see that the second sand does stutter. I didn't actually notice at the time, but it does. And the reason for that is, as noted before, that tension spring underneath the chronograph wheel. So off camera I did tighten that spring a little bit, and we'll see later on that the second sand moves smoothly. Now let's check the reset. And then we can put the bezel on. And that's a satisfying snap, I must say. So with the watch almost done, I felt that the crown was really out of place as well, because it's kind of rose gold. So I turned to my crown collection and let's see what we can find. So I'm going to test a few different ones until we find one that fits. I actually think that one looks nice. The crowns need to have the correct thread. Stick with this one. So this one actually looks like the best fit. Quite similar to the rose gold one as well, which is not original. All right, I think. So what we have to do then is make sure that the stem fits the case, because each crown has a little bit different lengths of the tube and so forth. So I'm typically using my screwdrivers to mark the correct distance. And then after filing it down a little bit, which I'm not going to bother you with because of the sound, we can then put some Loctite on the threads. Of course we only do that when we know the length is correct. Now back to that issue I mentioned. This little gap here in that metal ring needs to be where the operating lever is. Otherwise the whole chronograph might stick. And with that we are pretty much done with the watch. Here we have it after tensioning up the tension spring. Before seeing the watch on the wrist, I just want to remind everyone that at vintagewatchservices.eu you'll always find more than 100 beautiful vintage watches. And as a YouTube subscriber, you can use this coupon code for 10% off. And there we have it. José's wonderful old Exim chronograph. Gold case, now with a gold-plated bezel, but it looks pretty alright, I think. It's better than just a crystal. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, then clicking like and subscribe will really help the channel. I'll be back with another video shortly. Until then, ta-ta.